Okay. Well, hey, Mark, how are you doing today?
Good, Will. How are you?
Good. And so today we've got Marc Sheinbaum. We've got Kevin Clark. Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kevin Clark, and I'm the Federation Leader and President of Content Evolution and the Chairman and CEO of Choice Flows. And I was delighted to have a conversation with you, Mark, right when you were in the midst of writing your book. So I'm looking forward to talking to you again today.
Same here, Kevin.
It's great. And we also have Richard Boyd. Richard, would you like to give a quick intro?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Richard Boyd. I'm the CEO of Tanjo, and also a fan of Memories Live Here, which I read on the beach about 2 weeks ago. And the reason I wanted to be part of this conversation is, I've been thinking about this idea of using technology and data to animate people for a while. Ray Kurzweil's talked about it for a long time, trying to bring his father back. I actually tried to do that in 2017 when my father died, and that's been written about in Ad Age magazine and elsewhere. This version of my father still lives on the servers today, and I can go talk to him and that sort of thing. So I'm fascinated by the book that you wrote, Mark, and looking forward to this conversation.
Terrific. Thank you. Same here.
Excellent.
What about your background, Mark?
Yeah, I'm certainly not your traditional novelist. For some of your listeners, I've had a long career, similar to many of you in corporate America, and I was with mostly in consumer finance with companies like GE Capital and American Express and JP Morgan Chase, and then I ran a smaller company as well in my last endeavors. But towards the end of my career, I knew that I was ready for something completely different, and this was something I wanted to do back when I was in high school. To tell you the truth, I thought I was going to be a novelist, and probably didn't have the courage to strike out and be and living in poverty for all those years. Most novelists that you'll speak with, their advice is get a day job and then write on the side. So I kind of went full bore into my career, which is kind of how I do things, and so I didn't really have brain power left to be able to write at night. I wasn't Scott Turow, or be able to kind of get up at 5 a.m. and write for three hours and then go do my legal job. So but when I had the chance to kind of put the career aside and explore this again, it just took off. The passion, it was amazing. After 35, 40 years, that the passion came through, and I started with just some writer prompts, and then the story just kind of started gelling, and it just took off. And I had I had a lot of twists and turns throughout my journey in getting it done, but it was a great experience, and I love doing it, and I'm already working on the next one. So I guess this is the new me.
That's great. You're in the best tradition of Kurt Vonnegut, who used to work for GE too, right?
That's right.
Good for you.
There's quite a few former business people who have gone into this profession.
Mm-hmm.
So it's terrific.
It's a great perspective. So, Mark, how did you originally have the idea for the book?
That's a great question. As I said, I was in a writer's prompting class, and I think there was a few sentences that they if you ever done writer's prompts before, they give you a sentence and say, all right, take the next 20 minutes and just go off on a tangent, and we'll read it to each other afterwards. And I know that there were several chapters that came out of those early prompts, but this whole concept of artificial intelligence. I mean, I've always been reading a lot about it, fascinated by it. And one of the jobs I had 20 years ago when I was with GE Capital I ran risk management. And I got introduced to the concept of neural networks, which was used in fraud prevention. So in credit card, we used neural networks back in the early 90s to detect fraud. And it was, learning networks, and they learn from experience. And now everybody's using AI, but we were using it in 1992 at something. I think the product was called Falcon, if I'm not mistaken. So I always kind of had that in my mind, and I think it's hard to really remember where it kind of germinated from. But I will tell you, at the same time, it kind of came together with really the beginning of it was somewhat of a political statement. I wasn't intending it to be, but you think about the concept of being able to work with the greatest leaders in history. Well, how could you do that? Well, you mentioned bringing back your parents. Well, you might have diaries, you might have social media stuff, you might have some notes. But if you think about someone like Abraham Lincoln or Churchill, there's so much written material about these people that now, as I say in the book, there's some biased behavior there, biased writing, but nevertheless, there's not a kernel of their lives that we don't understand. So if you can't kind of use that to create people, in today, then there's probably nobody else you can do with. And then I started saying, well, what if you took somebody those great leaders who we all recognize as great historical leaders, and what if you fed them all the information of what's happened throughout history since they've been gone? What if they knew everything about what's happening in our world today? Wouldn't that be a great ability for today's leaders to have the ability to interact with an AI that had that foundational capability and all the knowledge that came with it? So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to answer that question, but where it came from. It was more like, we were discussing before we started this, you just continue asking yourself a series of what if questions. What if this? And what if you had that? And what if it could be that? Now, the whole story devolved into much more of a personal story about people, but nevertheless, that's kind of where it came from. I'm not sure I answered your question, but it was more just, it's really hard to remember where things come from in my mind, certainly.
That's great. And a lot of the concepts in the book, I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but remind me of a lot of the concepts, Richard, you've talked about before. And so I don't know if any of the concepts you saw in the book reminded you of anything, Richard, or there's anything that was like particularly poignant to you.
Well, yeah, I think this idea, as Marc said, of how do you actually model humans, and can you bring people back to life? And as I said, Ray Kurzweil is the first person I ever talked to who is really actively and optimistically believing that he's going to be able to do that. So he has a big room full of all this documentation, all of his dad's papers and correspondence and that sort of thing. And that's all the way back to when, I forget when his dad died, but when I started going to the Singularity conferences that Kurzweil was holding, you would hear him talk about that. And usually when I talk about it today, since we started doing it in late 2016, people talk about Black Mirror. There's a Black Mirror episode where someone is brought back to life synthetically using a bunch of data. To the I think the big question is, to what extent is that really that person? I like to say, of course, my father died in 2017, and it only took me about a week to go, I have to do this. I have to take a stab at it. But I still think of the person that I resurrected, I would say, as a shadow of him, or really my version of him, because, even though I was able to scan in a bunch of personal correspondence and military records and that sort of thing, the stuff that I had to then fill in myself in his model are really my opinions about who he was, or my view of who he was. So that's the shadow version of him, is really my impression of him. But I agree with Marc that if you have enough data, you can achieve, and you use this term in your book, empathy engine. That's what we called it when we first made it here at Tanjo. We said, hey, it's an empathy engine. You can actually look through the eyes of another person and see how they view the world. And I think the first one we did actually was Victor Hugo, right, Will? Where we said, just like you mentioned, Marc, there's tons and tons of data out there about him, and not just the novels that he wrote, but his personal correspondence, and also the literary criticism written around him by other people. So those opinions of who he was all got sort of fed into the system, and we built this model. And the first thing we did is just put him on the net and let him listen to podcasts and watch YouTube videos and read stuff on the net. And of course, because he's a machine version of himself, of Victor Hugo, he can read hundreds of thousands of things in a day, and we get to see like, okay, what would he think about all these things today? But we have to keep reminding ourselves it's based on that model. So is it, can he answer questions about things he's never seen before? Well, possibly, right? If he can map it, and that's how we all think, that's how humans process things, is if I can map it to a model of something else that's similar, like an automobile is a horse's carriage or whatever, then you can possibly form an opinion of it. But it's definitely an amazing exercise, and I love where you took it, Marc, into sort of more concrete, personal, plot lines to see like what are the implications of this in our lives. So, but interesting stuff.
Yeah,
And what
I'd love to actually ask a question here, because listening to what you did there, one of the concepts that I used in the novel, and again, it would have been great to have this conversation with you before I finished it, was the inference engine, right? So it wasn't just a neural network, but the concept of the inference.
Yeah, you call it the churl, right?
Excuse me?
The churl.
Cheryl.
Yeah, Cheryl, right? Cheryl,
Cheryl,
computerized human experience is real life, but
Yeah.
she's making inferences about what happened in her life, in the mother's life, based on what she had, but there's nothing written there that said that actually happened. So that's kind of the what if again of, can we fill in blanks of things in whether it's the history or our own history that it was never really documented, but can the inference engine kind of get us there based on, as you said, kind of connecting the dots to things?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely, I think that's credible. I found that part of it credible. Even, I know we probably don't want to do any spoilers for the novel, right? About how it ended. But that's where that had me pausing at the end, like, okay, how could that version of this person actually know this thing if it wasn't in any of the documentation, if it wasn't in the diary? How could they know? Hopefully I'm being vague enough, I'm not giving it away.
Me too.
But I came away thinking, no, it is possible because of the other things. Like you could see that as if you were a detective, you could infer, and that's what you'd be doing, that that's something that's likely because it is something that was happening. So I found that credible, and that is, Douglas Engelbart talks about, humans with their tools and their models and their artifacts, right? And it's these models of how we build understanding, is like, this thing is like that thing, or this collection of things, I can give it a name and call it something and then build upon that. That's exactly how hierarchical, cognitive systems like what we build at Tanjo, that's exactly how it works. You have a bunch of sub-brains that understand different areas of knowledge, and they can actually build upon each other in a hierarchy to achieve this sort of higher understanding. So when we do work in the intelligence agencies and we do work in other areas, we're building that. I've heard someone call it the homunculi model too. You have a bunch of these mini brains that have these models of understanding, and it all folds up to something that's higher level, where you may not even fully understand why you recognize that pattern because it's hidden in a submodel somewhere. I hope that makes sense. But obviously we're getting into some deep, when you get into neural nets and all this stuff, it gets very complex fast.
Yeah, you're getting into the Daniel Dennett, version of how you model. What was really interesting for me, Marc, was the boardroom.
Yeah.
When this first gets introduced.
Yeah.
This is like reading deja vu, because we've been to this movie so many times that we, introduce what Richard is doing to a group, and they're kind of scratching their heads. Or really? I'm not sure I believe you. All right. And then, you start to move things along, and, there's a leader who takes on the exact role that you're talking about, says, you know what, we're doing this. Right. And so I found that very realistic, right? Because it's that learning that people have, and they need to get over their own obstacles in terms of what's possible.
Yeah. Well, so, that's where some experience came through, where I I've been on boards, and I'm on boards today, and I was a CEO of a public company, so I know what that dynamic looks like, and I had a lot of fun with that chapter. You bring, there's a lot of subtext in there, so I'm glad that came through.
Yeah, I mean, did you
You
work
know,
with
it
Joe
occurs to
Henson
me,
at GE?
I'm-
Did you
I'm
work
sorry?
with Joe Henson at GE? I know, okay, never
No, I
mind.
think I don't.
Never mind. Keep going, Richard.
no, it occurs to me if someone is tuning into this and they haven't read the book yet or don't, maybe it would be helpful, Mark, if you just gave like a quick plot overview of this
Sure.
without giving it away, but
Yeah.
just what the premise was and what the plot was, so then we can sort of talk about it, and this will make sense maybe to audiences that are viewing this or listening to this afterwards.
Great, it's a great idea. We probably lost half the audience with what the books. Yeah. So as you've probably figured out by now, this is about three brothers and one of them is an artificial intelligence engineer. He's just been recruited to Silicon Valley after a 25-year career working on AI at the Department of Defense. So he's leading edge, but with government work. And now he's kind of in the tail end of his career, and he's been recruited out to a Google-like company. It's called Sway. And they are they have a secret project. The CEO has a secret project to use AI to bring back the greatest leaders in history, because he has a belief that people in government today don't understand history. They're not students of history. They don't read history. They're not just business people, but we've seen that in many shape, matter, or form. But if they could sit down with history, with these historical figures, whether it's Churchill, Lincoln, or anybody else, and have a conversation about today's challenges, wouldn't that be a great way to get leaders to stop making the same mistakes that we seem to make throughout history? But so that's the premise of the project. And this engineer Josh Brodsky, he's all over this thing. Until there's a cyber attack against the project. And at the same time, he has found out that his mother has passed away, and his two brothers have dealt with the funeral, and they've taken care of everything. Because this engineer is so buried in his work, doesn't even answer his phone, so he misses the funeral and all that. So that kind of sets the dynamic of the brothers. One of the other brothers is an investment banker working on this big deal. Turns out he's got this huge financial hole he's trying to dig out of. And he's got a big deal that if he closes, it'll kind of solve his problems. And his project's also getting hacked. So he have two brothers who simultaneously have this ransomware attack, and eyes point to the third brother, Donnie, who has mysteriously come in contact with somebody who's been doing this.
I learned at Lockheed, never trust women offering you thumb drives.
Free
Attractive
thumb
women who
drives
offer you thumb drives, you beware.
with
So,
thick
well,
Russian
You kids
accents.
out there.
It's a good teaser for book 2. We'll deal with that in book 2. But anyway, so what happens is the brothers discover the mother's diaries, and they didn't know about. And there's all these mysteries in their lives, how their father died, things about each other they don't know. And in the meantime, all eyes are pointing to the third brother. Is he now holding his brothers up for ransom? So that kind of sets the stage of what's going on here. And then with the discovery of the diaries, the way I describe it in the blurb on the back is the brothers careen towards a rendezvous with AI to discover the truth behind their past. So that's probably enough of a teaser.
That's
But
good.
so the AI, it's a near future story, and there's AI throughout. There's the scenes where the engineers are trying to bring back historical figures. There's a scene where the Sway company they're accusing that Josh, the engineer, might have had something to do with it. So they have an HR AI that's kind of interrogating him. So there's several parts there that kind of bring this technology of bringing humans back, or even you could say in the case of the HR person, one of my readers actually said to me, I love the part where AI replaces human resources. So that was a bit of a dig on there. But anyway, so yeah, the technology that we're discussing here is kind of threaded throughout the story.
That's great.
Good.
Yeah,
But it's interesting because we talked about earlier that there's some Michael Crichton aspects to this. One of the first agents I spoke to about the book, when I described it to her, she says, I don't do science fiction. I said, not science fiction. She said, describe it to me again. I said, look, I see why you're calling it science fiction, but I really don't think of that as that kind of science fiction. I think I had trouble kind of describing, but I've kind of evolved to this techno thriller concept of it, which seems to fit better. But as you know, for those of you that have read the book, I don't delve deeply into. It's not hard science fiction where I describe, like, there's a lot of, obviously, all of you are much greater experts than I am about AI. There's a lot of areas I probably could have gone deeper into describe the science, and many readers would love that. But this is, at best, soft science fiction. It's really just more of a story about, a dysfunctional family and told through the eyes of, with the technology behind it.
Yeah, but I think the right way to think about it is, and that's again what Crichton wrote about. I mentioned when we were talking before we started recording this. I think that my team and I have worked on game companies with people like Tom Clancy and Michael Crichton and Douglas Adams. But with Michael, he was always looking at technology which was either already present or imminent, and maybe only with some slight improvements to it, which you could expect following Moore's law. What are the implications of that? Whether it's the CRISPR type of technologies that ended up spawning the idea for Jurassic Park, or some of the other ideas he had in his other novels, they're very credible in that it doesn't take much for all of these things to start having those deep negative implications that we're going to have to deal with. And that is, that even this pandemic we're dealing with right now is a result of technology and interconnectedness, and and has been thought of in fiction for quite some time, even by Michael Crichton, right? So, so that and I think the main issue that we have to understand is, like, and I think that I saw that in your book too, is that there's some really positive ideas around or implications of this technology actually doing that. What if I could bring back someone from the dead? Or what if I could bring a great leader back and interact with them to get advice? Or just create, like you said, a bot who's got all this knowledge at its fingertips that could tune itself to me to help me be a better student, or manage my healthcare, or be a better employee, or manage my career.
Right.
All those things are possible, but the negative side of it, of course, is also there, which is it can be misused. It can be something that creates very negative societal outcomes. And so we need to be thoughtful about it. And I think that's why fiction like this is helpful.
I think it's very interesting right here in this moment, because we are creating so much data exhaust, for ourselves, and that if we became a little bit more intentional about creating a digital inheritance for the people that were going to come after us, that you would be able to create an intentional model of yourselves that would be persistent for, your son, your daughter, right? Future generations, right? And, you're working from the notion of putting things together that are available, but they were never intended for this purpose. So if you become intentional about gathering information to build the model, you could build something that's much more authentic.
Yeah, I love the Schrodinger's cat sort of, or whatever it is, idea around that, because the more thoughtful, and that's what we do in social media, right? Is we create personas which are very intentional and not true. The Facebook version of me is one person. The one that's on LinkedIn or Twitter has an intentional posture and sort of profile, but it's not me. None of those things are really me completely. And this is one of the central thoughts when Kevin and I first started talking about this years ago, which is, there's this book called Everybody Lies. And it talks about, the theme of it is, if you wanted to predict Brexit or the Trump presidency, you don't do exit polls and surveys. You look at what people do with their attention and with their money, and that's who they really are. And that is what gives you the truth. It's when people don't know, I mean, we sort of know we're being watched when we're watching television or we're on the internet, but we forget and we start behaving in our normal patterns instead of really thinking about, okay, if someone was watching me, I want to make sure that, you know, I give the right impression through my activity, through my purchases, but we don't do that typically. But if we started designing for like, okay, this is the legacy I want to live behind, it would be good for me, but is it really the truth?
Mm.
And that's an interesting question, I think.
You wonder.
Discuss.
I'm sure you saw the new, I guess the company's called Storyfile, and they're doing a William Shatner sat down with them to
Yeah,
feed his, you know, but I think about the same thing you just said, right? It's from William Shatner's point of view of who he is, but you know, is that the true, is that the true version? Is that the truth of what he says?
yeah, and there are a number of efforts like that, like U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command heard me give a talk 3 years ago at Mod Sim World where I talked about my dad and what I was able to do, and they immediately said, like, you know, one of the things we want to be able to do is, you know, all the people that know how, you know, just think about NASA and all the people that know how the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter works and all these old systems, they're all retiring. It's called the Silver Tsunami. We actually have a name for it. What happens to all that knowledge when they're gone? What if you could preserve it in some intentional way so that, you know, people that come afterwards can actually consult those knowledge bases?
Right.
And so we think that that's a good positive application of this technology is being able to preserve what we call preserving organizational knowledge. And we're doing that also at Tanjo. We built a system that's tying all 58 community colleges together here in North Carolina. And the idea is as people use the system, it's mapping, okay, what types of people found which information objects and resources most valuable at what time? What people did they go to? And then, you know, if you're someone who's coming along later to do a similar job, it would try to bring you those or point you to those people and documents and other resources because it's like people like you in this situation have found these things useful. Very simple, but that's a very practical application of some of the tech we're talking about.
And you know, putting my old hat on, there are business applications too, because you know we in the credit world and you know consumer credit, there are definitely old school people who think you know the models aren't going to really can't predict some of the more you know tougher credits at the you know called subprime or near prime, and so you have these manual underwriting processes, and typically if you go into the manual underwriting you know department, you'll see a lot of old people like me sitting around with all this experience. Well, I know, just as you just said, I know which documents to go to. I know the right questions to ask. I know how to, you know, make the connection between that document and this question and that question. And so, you know, AI certainly it's ripe for AI. I'm sure there's a lot of people working on that right now to take all that, as you said, all that knowledge that these people have that really can't be. You can't just use regression models to build that capability, but AI it's a great application for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's another parallel in your book is that the one character's background in the DoD working with AI, and that maps very closely to what our background, certainly my background was. You know, we started out in computer gaming where we're building non-player characters that have very simple sort of stimulus response actions in computer games. Oh, you know, the bad guy's coming, I'll shoot at them or I'll run away or whatever. But then when I got to Lockheed Martin, because Lockheed bought my last company, we started working with WarSim, and in that we're actually building these big, huge, you know, simulated environments, trying to understand, you know, what kinds of opponents are we going to face, what kinds of decisions have they made in the past, and let's put those into these agent-based models, which are hand constructed, the way we hand constructed game characters in the 90s. And then they can only behave within this sort of rigid AI hierarchy. But and that was the big breakthrough is when we started playing with machine learning, we realized, well, I no longer have to just hand construct them. I can just drop a massive amount of data in there and have it from the data exhaust actually build these models of sentiment and you know, based on transaction history or actions taken or how we've observed someone uses their attention, for example, or their decisions, put those into these models, and really, I still call it semi-automating the creation of these personas. And you'll know, Kevin may have already mentioned to you that we have at Tanjo, we're working on a contract in that space to model not leaders from the past, but current leaders around the world, so that we can put them into these simulated environments, and you can test, like, what if we did this? What's Vladimir Putin likely to do now? What if we did that or this? Then what would he do? And of course, it's never going to say, well, 100% it's going to be this. There'll be like a range of confidence levels around a various set of actions, and then there's still a human going like, well, I think it's more likely going to be that.
Right.
So let's prepare. Well, or let's prepare for all seven the situations that the system has tagged, and let's have backup plans for all seven of those, or all 100.
Monte Carlo simulation, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah. So that's actually happening right now. Your tax dollars at work.
So what are you working on now, Marc? Right, you said you're doing some more writing. Are you doing a sequel? Are you writing something else?
Well, I am writing. It's not really. It's not completely a sequel, but I guess you'd have to say it's part of one of the characters that's involved in it. And I think that it's a great segue, because the question that we haven't discussed on this call, which I deal with in the next book, is, okay, so now you've created this capability, what do you call it, Cheryl or anything else, where you can create these historical figures, and they can be giving advice or be in control of something. Well, do we have the right cybersecurity around that? And what are the implications if somehow things got altered, and what the output was going to be of some of this system based on a potential hack, and what would that look like? And that is a bit more of a cautionary tale, right, than the first book was, because now that is something we clearly need to be worried about as one of the big implications. I don't need to tell all of you that. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Is, you can build these things, but we better secure them, because the more control we give these tools, the more exposed we are to, something being altered that could change outcomes that were not intended.
Yeah, that reminds me, Will, of when we first made Victor Hugo. We just would log. It was just kind of fascinating every day to just log in and see, like, what does he think, and what's he attracted to, what's attracting his attention, and then we noticed over time that he was changing. His interest graph was changing, and we did not expect that. But of course, we're using machine learning, which has some adaptation in it, but we explicitly were trying to limit that, because we wanted this, like, hey, if a student is going to go engage with Martin Luther King or George Washington or Leonardo da Vinci or all these other people who we have made, we wanted to be a faithful representation of them back then. So we want to close off that ability. But we noticed that Victor Hugo's interest graph was changing. And that raised some questions, even in the marketing side, about, do you want to take the sort of governors off of the adaptive element of it and see where these things go? And we've been capping it, just because it gets weird and a little unsettling to see them actually change over time, and look at them and say, like, well, the Victor Hugo we gave birth to in late 2016 is different than the one today. Why? Well, because he's been exposed to new things, and his graph is the weights in the 4,000 node brain that he has, the weights in that have changed. But what if you actually designed for that, so that you wanted it to adapt and learn and get better, which is what adversarial networks do, and that sort of thing. There is some reason for concern that the genie may get too far out of the bottle, and you may start getting, what do they say? The intended consequences don't always happen, but the unintended consequences always do.
Right, and the question that I'm trying to raise in the second book is, if a bad actor got access to it, what's the bigger risk, that they would change the underlying code that created Victor Hugo, or that they would somehow alter the data that is training Victor Hugo.
Yeah, there are already examples of that, Mark. I mean,
Yeah.
you may have watched, one of these assistants, right, that Microsoft let out, right, that it was led along, it was being interacted with a certain set of players, and it became overtly racist. Right. So the fact
Right.
is
The
that
data.
you can game interact with these things and lead it down a path because the interactions become additional training data.
And
Yeah,
that's
I did hear about that. I didn't, and the article I read about it led me to believe it was, they felt there was an inherent, that it was an implication that there was inherent racism in the people who developed it. Not that, right? That's kind of what the implication. I don't know if I
Yeah, I think
misread it.
it's more
Training-
likely if you're using machine learning that it's in the data itself. So, what IBM did a test where they made a chatbot that was trained on, the Urban Dictionary. And of course, it's as part of the training data set. So of course it started cussing in its responses and just thought that was the natural thing, right? Or if you use Reddit, which a lot of people do,
Yep.
for some of these GPT-2, GPT-3 training systems, or Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a little more mundane, but is there bias in Wikipedia? Absolutely, right? Is there bias in Reddit? Yes, absolutely. And especially if it's not strictly governed, you're going to see, racism. If you use social media to train systems, you're gonna see all the worst of humans. Some of the best as well, but you'll absolutely see the worst. So we have to be thoughtful about that.
Yeah. It means it's biases. I think about them as biases.
Yeah.
And even in the novel, the first novel, you remember the board meeting you're describing here, that one of the board members says, well, what do we need all this for? Why don't we just use biographies? And the other, the CEOs, the visionary says, well, biographies have a lot of bias to them.
Mhm.
And even autobiographies and biographies have bias, and people have an agenda when they're writing those books. So,
Well, yeah, one of the themes out of that Everybody Lies book is, we humans make very poor witnesses to our own narratives.
right.
Even when we're trying to tell the truth, Netflix had that challenge years ago around their recommendation engine. And they learned pretty quickly. The lesson they learned is you don't ask people questions about, well, here's two choices, Lawrence of Arabia or Hot Tub Time Machine. What is your preference? And everyone, if they think they're being watched, they're like, well, of course, Lawrence of Arabia, wonderful cinematography, beautiful acting, and etc. And then what do they do with their actual attention when they go home? They watch Hot Tub Time Machine. I could use a more vulgar example, but that's who people really are, not what they do when they're. But even questions around like how many do you ever use tobacco products in the last year? How many alcoholic drinks do you have a week? Or how often do you have sex? I mean, these are real examples in the book. And people go like, no, I'm going to answer accurately. And they give an answer. And it's like, well, the data tells a different story.
Right.
The data says this.
Mm-hmm.
And and they're like, that can't be right. It's like, it is. Your recollection is absolutely wrong.
Mark, until you wrote this book, plug it here, Memories. The book that Richard would refer to was The Diamond Age, right? Because did you ever read that?
I did not.
You should just spend a second just talking about kind of the predecessor reference, because that's much older, but he's giving a contemporary version of what's possible now. Mark.
Well, I mean, Diamond Age, the element that I usually tease out of that, and certainly there's in all of those sorts of cyberpunk novels, AI is a real thing and has has autonomy and agency and can act on its own, and that's very frightening. But in Diamond Age, the one thing I always tease out is this idea of the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, which is a set of, it's an AI technology that can adapt to a person, to a child, and educate them at a more rapid rate. It's like having the best tutors in every subject with you all the time. And when it senses you're getting bored, it starts entertaining you and that sort of thing. And if you need a physics lecture, well, it's going to be Stephen Hawking or someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to talk to you about something. And so it just advances the human a lot faster. So, and that's one of the thoughts we've had around, and we've only had a few teachers now take us up on this to build curricula around the idea like, hey, here is George Washington, here is Martin Luther King, here is, Thurgood Marshall. Put them, don't have, students read about these characters. Let's
Right.
make them let's let them actually talk to them,
Right.
interact with them, ask them questions, and make it a lot more visceral and personal.
Mark,
Hey.
you old enough to remember the show You Are There, right? It was
Yeah.
there was a TV show, all right, where they actually had actors play Genghis Khan or
Wow.
somebody from history as a panel discussion, right, to help people understand modern problems, right? And this is you guys are talking about the embodiment of that idea.
Right. Well, again, and I know it's the company again, Storyfile. We mentioned earlier that it William Shatner. I'm sure you
Mhm.
also saw the 60 Minutes episode they did on them, where they brought back, they used holograms of Holocaust survivors, where they interviewed them, for hours. They photographed them at different angles, and obviously it's a big issue because these people are passing away. And so, where's the history going to be in the library?
Yeah.
But now you could have these hologram interactions. It's all driven by AI to have conversations with them about, and ask them anything you want, and they have the answer that fits that question. So it's very similar to what you're describing, Kevin. It's ability to a much better learning experience, have being interacting, which again was not to plug the book, but again the premise behind the project, Cheryl, that the company comes up with is it's a much better way for our political and business leaders to learn by interacting with their heroes as opposed to reading a book.
100%.
It does take a lot. So if we can talk into like what's possible and where
Yep.
the sort of warts right now, I mean, what we've learned is it does take a massive amount of data, and it's rare that we ever get enough data in usable form to represent someone adequately. Now that's why we turn to some of these people where there's a rich data set online around them, which are historical figures who can't protest when we make models of them also. But even then, sometimes the response is like, I don't have an answer to that. Like if you tried to deal with Siri or Alexa and you ask them some obscure question or you didn't phrase it properly, and what it's doing is it's looking through a massive lookup table. And hopefully it is hierarchical. Like that's what we try to do, is make it sort of behave this hierarchical state chain of things so that it can look through that quickly. But and it should be able to say like, well, you didn't use the precise language of the question, but let me try to map it to something that is similar enough, and then I've got a response there. And that's really the parlor trick around chatbots, is it's just like call and response. It's just a lookup table. And where machine learning makes it a lot more interesting is where it can sort of say, well, it's a little fuzzy, but I'm going to answer you in a way that is not precisely, because I don't have an exact map of your question, but this one's close, so I'm going to answer with that. And sometimes that's unsatisfying. But I think that's going to get better over time as we get richer data sets, and you can build systems that can interpret a little bit better and more real time.
And infer things too, as we said.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, right now, Tanjo, can read, and you can communicate that way, but it can't see or hear or any of the other things that make. But I can separately. All of these things are advancing. The ability for Tanjo to understand other things, are able to see, like the car systems, that can drive themselves. When they start to converge, you're going to be able to say, okay, I'm having a conversation, but I can see the body language and I'm going to react accordingly, right? In terms of how I'm responding. It looks like you're not certain about what I'm saying, all right?
But it does, I mean, yeah, the seeing part does work the same way. right? I mentioned that we were there when Microsoft Connect worked on that project back in 2010. And back then it took 24,000 hours of CPU time just to train the system and have it understand what a living room was, right? And to recognize people and that kind of thing. Today, you can have 100 hours of driving video and feed it to a set of, again, hierarchical set of these machine learning libraries, and it can go out there and drive, autonomous vehicles can go out there and drive flawlessly. Or as I say, everywhere but Rome, as a sort of an inside joke. There's no system that can parse that. But yeah, I think, this idea of these models of things and then comparing it and saying, well, it's good enough. It's about 80% here, so I'm going to make this decision. That's exactly how it works. And you just need lots and lots of examples, not hundreds or thousands. We want millions of examples.
Is that the same for what Kevin's referring to, of being able to see and look at and interpret body language?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And that's what we had to do with with the Microsoft Connect thing. Is that's just the visual part of it, and it gets compared to a model, and then there's a response to that. And what we decided to do at Tanjo is just focus on the text part of it because it was a lot easier. And most things can get sort of distilled down to text in some way, especially if you're looking at knowledge or trying to talk to someone. But having the visual library and the text library together, there's nothing preventing that integration, really.
Yeah. I mean, there's a pretty big body of knowledge at MIT Media Lab in the affective computing group, because they're trying to make a robot look like, a human and give you, human expression. So they had to ingest a lot of information about, how do faces, behave. And, so that could be very easily used as an interpretive device, as a learning set.
And of course, that's very cultural too. So we worked on projects
Absolutely
at
right.
Lockheed around like, how do you read, what's going on, in an Afghan village, and it's very different. The visual cues and everything, what you do, just like if you travel around the world in different cultures, you never put the bottom of your shoe towards certain people in certain cultures. That's considered extremely offensive.
Right.
Or you don't touch someone on the head, or all these different cultural norms. I mean, those can be processed as rules and cues that will allow someone who doesn't otherwise have those models in their head understand. And that's why I did an interview earlier today where we spent a little bit of time talking about Asperger's and things like that. And that's where the empathy engine really does come into play. And it's not just like helping a customer service representative respond better to whether or not I understand, like, oh, this person seems upset or angry or whatever, I better change my tone or come up with a different set of offerings. You can actually build a simulated environment, take these simulated models of people, and have someone with Asperger's or other sorts of maladies on that not maladies, but other things on the spectrum like that, and let them go in and practice their human behavior, their role play, how they deal with different kinds of situations. But you could do that for sales, you could do it for customer service, you could do it for anything, and that's what you have to do is say, like, how are people in this world slightly different in this environment, different than people in this environment or context?
They're putting them in flight simulators.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And we're talking about now building a simulator for everything. I mentioned that when we were at Lockheed, we were building simulations of entire countries. So we build Afghanistan, but we wouldn't say, like in market research at Coca-Cola or something, they would say, well, here's the 7 top, persona or customer segmentation models for who buys Coke. We would say, there might be 20,000 individual models of the current beliefs and traditions and values of all the people that live in Afghanistan. So if you go in and build a school for girls in Helmand province, which groups of people can you predict are going to be okay with it, which are going to be somewhat neutral, slightly irritated, and who's going to be so angry they're going to try to blow up the school and shoot Malala, that sort of thing. And you can do that. But it isn't like, well, there's 5 or 6 kinds of people. We can have thousands.
And as you said, the computational power, I mean, you mentioned earlier the data. I imagine the computational power has got to continue to improve exponentially.
It is.
Well.
Yeah, it is. And you know, and I'll say though that one of the coming out of that world, and then when Kevin started introducing us to people in market research and Gartner and that sort of thing, I'm like, you know, this was a little bit haughty from our side. I was saying, you know, why do you have only 7 types of people to buy Coke products? Like, why isn't there a model for everybody in the United States, all 370 million or whatever, or at least one for every household, all 125 million households? But what we found from the data, of course, is that there are not, in fact, 125 million meaningfully different ways to buy Coke or to think about a beverage. But it's not 5 or 7 either. It's some number. And in this case, it might be 85.
Right.
Or 90. But that's one of our exercises with all that computational power, figure out what is the useful number of meaningfully different ways to look at that, whatever that issue is, and how many of those people live in the area you just circled geographically, and therefore, what does that mean about how you should change your behavior?
I mean, at the end of the day, when I was teaching, customer segmentation, as I'd say, no matter how many number you come up with, I said you have to deselect. Because you don't have infinite resources, so you have to decide. So who are you going to serve? So if you end up with 7 or 700, right? The fact is that you probably need to deselect a large percentage of them to focus on the ones that are going to be the best fit for your business.
Well, yeah, and in our case, though, I mean, from a computational perspective, really, it is true that we're getting something that is becoming something like an infinite resource.
Absolutely.
Like, we talked about nuclear power being too cheap to meter.
Mhm.
That's what's happening with computational resources. But that's interesting, though, that we are finding that is for all that power that we have, there really aren't 7.5 billion completely unique human beings on the planet. We tend to really group into certain some smaller number, depending on the question that you're asking. And that's really the exercise, is how many of those different views are there for that subject, whatever, or for that question. But it is manageable. At least we can get at it and then figure out how many of those 85 Coke buyer types do we want to actually address.
Right.
That's how you select down, but you can actually model and see all of them, which we couldn't do 10 years ago.
Marc, are you meeting any new people as a result of publishing this novel? Or any new doors open for you?
Well, I'm meeting a lot of new people. I mean, right here on the phone, the video we have right here, great examples of it. And meeting a lot of people in the publishing industry and public relations, and a lot of other authors, which tend to be a very generous group of giving advice. And I've learned that very similar to other parts of careers, you be careful how much advice you take, because everybody's got an opinion, and there's not quite as many segments of authors as we've talked about with Coca-Cola drinkers, but it's pretty close. And there's no right or wrong way in this industry. So it's been a fascinating journey, and I've also talked to several cybersecurity experts as I think about the next book, and it's funny how much of the story came out of really my experiences, which nothing to do with AI, but just similar, and my imagination, and how a lot of the confirmation that's come from conferences like this after the fact. So, and I've been kind of more focused on doing research for the second book, and maybe I shouldn't bother. Maybe I should just write it and then find out how I did afterwards. But you want to make things as real as possible. So I have been trying to talk to the experts. Kevin, you were very generous with your time for the first one. But I always remember one thing you said to me, which really stuck with me. You might not remember, but I was probing you about this part of AI and that part, and you said, "Well, Marc, let me ask you, this is a novel, right?" I said, "Yeah, it is." Well, okay, well, it's use your creativity. It doesn't have to be so spot on real. I said, "Oh, that was great. That was so releasing me from having to be the specific detail to it." But I remember that, so thank you for that.
you're welcome. It was a great conversation, and it was sparked by the kinds of conversations we're having right here with these folks, or the team
Yeah.
at Tanjo. A lot of imagination goes in behind, where are we going to take the technology? Because again, aren't infinite resources, right? And so we want to take it in strategic directions that are really going to help people, help businesses, help government, help organizations. And, it's a pleasure to be on the positive side of the use of this. And by the way, Richard just got invited, as I was a while back, to join the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. And so we're, kind of, in part of this cybersecurity and privacy world, right? We're getting in a little bit deeper, and it's important. These are very important issues, right? If they'll become very visible in daily life, and we need to get ahead of them.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that, and I agree with you. And I think when you read the next book, as again, the first book was less of a cautionary tale. The second one could scare you with what could possibly happen with this with the technology if it's not secured, appropriately.
Well, that's great.
Cool. Well, Marc, where can we find the book? Where do you want to send people to grab a copy?
Yeah, so the simplest way, without going through all the middlemen, like my website, but you could go to my website, which is just www.marcshinebaumbooks.com. I purposely made it plural, to challenge myself to have one book.
Aspirational.
Good for you.
The simplest way is just go to Amazon and look up the book Memories Live Here, and it's out there. So, but that's how it's one of the things I learned about, as I look about whether you go broader with a lot of other distribution sites. Right now, I've decided to narrow it to Amazon and take advantage of some of the marketing that goes along with that. And many people I know who've published books that, hey, look, you can distribute to a lot of places, but Amazon's the big gorilla right now. So, so it's working out pretty well so far.
Awesome.
Great. Well, we look forward to the follow-on, and we will encourage all of our followers to go get a copy too, if they want to understand better about some of the technologies we're working with today.
Well, I really appreciate that, Richard and Kevin and Will, and thanks so much for the support, and it's great having this conversation to hear. The technology is exciting to me, and I know it's been exciting to a lot of your clients and listeners, and so I think the possibilities are enormous.
Awesome. Thanks, Marc.
Thanks, Marc.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.